Judge Raymond Chambers sits stunned in first class as the flight attendant who just loudly accused him of stealing another passenger's seat is escorted off the plane, her face ashen. One phone call changed everything. Minutes earlier, she'd insisted no black man belonged in first class. Before we dive into this shocking story, where are you watching from today? Take a second to hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about justice being served. How would you react if someone questioned your right to be somewhere based solely on your appearance? Let's find out what happened next in this incredible true story. Raymond Chambers had earned every accolade in his distinguished 20-year career on the federal appeals court bench. At 58, his salt and pepper hair and keen brown eyes reflected both wisdom and weariness as he settled into his first class seat on Flight 11382 from Atlanta to Chicago. The past week had drained him completely. 7 straight days of testimony, he muttered to himself, tucking his leather briefcase carefully under the seat in front of him. The civil rights case he'd been adjudicating had drawn national attention. A group of black homeowners had filed suit against a major banking institution for discriminatory lending practices. The evidence was compelling but complex, requiring his absolute focus and impartiality, despite the personal resonance he felt with the plaintiffs. Now all Raymond wanted was to relax during the 2-hour flight before attending his daughter Clara's law school graduation tomorrow. He'd splurged on the first-class ticket as a rare self-indulgence. As one of only 8 black federal appeals court judges in the country, Raymond was accustomed to a life of careful moderation in all things. Too expressive, and colleagues questioned his judicial temperament. Too reserved, and he was labeled aloof. The balancing act had become second nature after decades of navigating predominantly white spaces. He settled into seat 3A by the window and exhaled deeply. The boarding process continued around him as he closed his eyes, centering himself. "Excuse me." The sharp voice startled him. Raymond opened his eyes to see a flight attendant standing over him, her name tag reading Melissa Harrison. Something in her expression immediately put him on alert. "Yes?" he responded politely. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" she asked, emphasizing sure, as if speaking to someone with limited comprehension. Raymond straightened. "Yes, 3A. That's what my boarding pass says." He reached for his ticket in his jacket pocket. Melissa's eyes narrowed as she watched him retrieve the ticket. "Let me see that," she said. Not as a request, but a demand. Without waiting, she reached for the boarding pass. Raymond handed it to her calmly, though he noticed several nearby passengers glancing over. Melissa examined the pass with exaggerated scrutiny. "This doesn't look right. How did you get this seat?" The implication in her tone was unmistakable. Raymond had encountered this before. The automatic assumption that his presence in a premium space must involve some kind of mistake or deception. "I purchased it just like everyone else," he replied evenly, maintaining the measured tone that had served him well in contentious courtroom situations. "These tickets are very expensive," Melissa stated flatly, handing the boarding pass back. With visible reluctance, Raymond nodded. "I'm aware of the cost." She remained standing over him, her body language suggesting the matter wasn't resolved to her satisfaction. "What's your final destination today?" she pressed. "Chicago." "This is a direct flight to Chicago, which is my destination," Raymond clarified, wondering why she needed this information when his boarding pass clearly stated it. Around them, the first-class cabin had grown quieter. Other passengers were now openly watching the interaction. Raymond felt the familiar weight of unwanted attention pressing down on him. Throughout his career, he had learned to function under such scrutiny, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. "And your reason for traveling?" Melissa continued her interrogation. Raymond paused before answering. There was no policy requiring passengers to explain their travel purposes. "Personal business," he finally responded, deliberately vague to highlight the inappropriate nature of her questioning. Melissa's lips tightened. "I need to check something. Stay here." Raymond almost laughed at the instruction to stay here, as if he had somewhere else to go on an aircraft still boarding. He noticed a white businessman who had just been seated across the aisle in 3B, watching the exchange with furrowed brows. Melissa returned moments later with a tablet. "Your name again?" she demanded. "Raymond Chambers," he stated clearly, though she had never asked for his name in the first place. She tapped on the tablet, frowning. "I don't see any Raymond Chambers in first class. That's not possible. I made this reservation weeks ago." Raymond reached for his phone to pull up the confirmation email. Before he could find it, Melissa cut him off. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. People like you don't typically fly first class with us." The cabin grew deathly quiet. The phrase, "people like you," hung in the air, its implication unmistakable. Raymond felt a familiar heat rising within him. Not merely anger, but the complex mix of emotions that came with these moments. The need to respond with enough force to maintain dignity, but not so much as to fulfill negative stereotypes about black anger. The businessman across the aisle spoke up. "Excuse me, what exactly do you mean by people like him?" Melissa turned, startled that someone had questioned her. "This is between the airline and this gentleman," she replied, the pause before gentleman making the word sound like a placeholder for something else. Raymond produced his confirmation email. "My reservation is confirmed. Seat 3A, first class. My credit card was charged accordingly." Melissa barely glanced at the screen. "Anyone can show anything on a phone. I need to see proper documentation." "The boarding pass you just examined is proper documentation," Raymond replied, his patience wearing thin but his voice remaining measured. "And I've shown you confirmation of payment." "Well, someone must have made a mistake," she insisted. "I'll need to check with my supervisor." As she walked away again, the businessman leaned over. "That was completely inappropriate. Would you like me to say something?" Raymond shook his head slightly. "Thank you, but I've handled worse." 20 years as a black federal judge had indeed exposed him to more subtle and more overt forms of prejudice than this. Still, the public nature of this confrontation was particularly grating. Melissa returned, this time with a male flight attendant. "Kevin, this passenger claims to have purchased a first-class ticket, but I can't find his reservation." Kevin looked at Raymond apologetically. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Raymond handed it over again, growing increasingly frustrated at having to repeatedly prove his right to occupy space. Kevin examined it and nodded. "This appears to be in order. Seat 3A, first class." "But he's not on my manifest," Melissa insisted. "What's your name, sir?" Kevin asked. "Raymond Chambers." Kevin checked his own tablet. "Mr. Chambers is indeed listed here. First class, seat 3A. Melissa's face flushed. Rather than apologizing, she snatched the tablet from Kevin. "Let me see that." After studying it, she looked back at Raymond with undisguised suspicion. This must have been a last-minute change. "When exactly did you book this flight?" Raymond's patience reached its limit. "That information is irrelevant. I have a confirmed reservation, which your colleague has verified. I've provided all necessary documentation. Is there something else specific you need from me? Or may I be allowed to sit in peace in the seat I purchased?" The directness of his response seemed to inflame rather than resolve the situation. Melissa's face hardened. "Sir, your hostile attitude is concerning me. If you can't communicate calmly, I'll need to involve security." Raymond almost laughed at the absurdity. He'd maintained judicial composure through cases involving terrorists and murderers, yet this flight attendant was characterizing his measured response as hostile. "I've been nothing but calm," Raymond replied. "Please explain specifically what you found hostile in my response." Instead of answering, Melissa turned to Kevin. "Call security. This passenger is being uncooperative and making me feel unsafe." Kevin looked uncomfortable, but nodded and moved toward the front of the plane. Several passengers exchanged concerned glances. The businessman across the aisle shook his head in visible disgust. As they waited for security to arrive, Raymond sat perfectly still, his mind racing through potential scenarios. He'd seen how quickly these situations could escalate, how readily authority figures would accept the word of a white woman claiming to feel threatened by a black man, regardless of his status or demeanor. He thought about his daughter Clara, waiting in Chicago. About the graduation he might miss if this situation derailed further. About the countless times throughout his career he'd been made to feel that his achievements, his position, his very presence was somehow provisional, subject to challenge at any moment by anyone who decided he didn't belong. The security officers boarded several minutes later, creating a spectacle that drew the attention of everyone on the plane. Raymond remained seated, hands visible on the armrests, expression neutral despite the humiliation burning within him. As Melissa began explaining her version of events, Raymond made a decision. There was a time for dignity through forbearance, and there was a time for action. Perhaps this moment called for the latter. The two airport security officers stood at the entrance to the first-class cabin, creating an immediate spectacle. Passengers in economy craned their necks to see what was happening, while those in first class studiously avoided eye contact with Raymond, all except the businessman in 3B who watched the scene unfold with open concern. "What seems to be the problem here?" asked the taller officer, a middle-aged white man whose name badge read, Keller. Melissa stepped forward immediately. "This passenger is being belligerent and refuses to verify his ticket information properly. He's making me feel unsafe." Raymond remained seated, hands clearly visible on the armrests, his expression deliberately neutral despite the anger simmering inside him. 20 years on the federal bench had taught him how quickly situations involving black men and authority figures could escalate, regardless of status or circumstances. "Sir, we need to see your boarding pass," Officer Keller stated firmly. For the third time, Raymond produced his boarding pass. "My name is Raymond Chambers. This is my assigned seat 3A, first class. The other flight attendant has already verified this information." The second security officer, a younger Hispanic man named Rodriguez, examined the boarding pass and nodded. "This looks legitimate," Melissa interjected quickly. "But he's not on my passenger manifest, and he won't explain how he got this ticket." "I purchased it online 3 weeks ago," Raymond stated clearly. "I've shown the confirmation email. Your colleague verified my reservation. What more verification do you require?" Officer Keller studied Raymond with the cautious assessment common to law enforcement, the automatic suspicion that Raymond had experienced countless times before, regardless of his tailored suit and professional demeanor. "Could I see some ID as well, sir?" Keller requested. Raymond reached slowly for his wallet, extracted his driver's license, and handed it over. He deliberately withheld his judicial identification. If they were going to treat him like any other black passenger, let them do so completely, at least for now. Keller examined the license carefully, comparing the photo to Raymond's face with exaggerated scrutiny. "And what brings you to Chicago, Mr. Chambers?" he asked, the subtle emphasis on Mr. rather than an honorific like Sir not lost on Raymond. "Personal business," Raymond repeated his earlier answer. Melissa jumped in again. "See, he's being evasive." The businessman across the aisle finally spoke up. "He's not being evasive. He's answering the questions directly. It's not a crime to fly first class while black, which seems to be the only issue here." Melissa's face flushed. "This has nothing to do with race. It's about security protocols. What security protocol requires interrogating a passenger whose ticket and identification are both valid?" The businessman countered. Officer Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the situation was unwarranted. "Everything appears to be in order with the documents, sir," he told his partner. Raymond's mind flashed back to numerous similar situations throughout his life and career. The time he was stopped 3 blocks from his own home because he matched a description, the court security guard who insisted he use the public entrance rather than the judge's entrance on his first day on the bench, the countless times he'd been followed in stores, questioned in first-class lounges, or asked if he was lost when walking in affluent neighborhoods. Each time, he had responded with restrained dignity. Each time, he had swallowed the indignity for the sake of avoiding escalation. Each time it had cost him something intangible but real, small sacrifices of self-respect that accumulated over decades. Melissa, perhaps sensing the security officer's wavering commitment, suddenly escalated her claims. "He threatened me earlier," she stated boldly. "When I first questioned him, he said he'd make sure I regretted it." Raymond's composure nearly broke. That is absolutely false. I said nothing of the kind. The businessman interjected again. I've been sitting right here the entire time. He never made any threats whatsoever. Other passengers began to murmur, some nodding in agreement. Officer Keller seemed uncertain now, looking between Melissa's insistent expression and Raymond's controlled one. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in the terminal, Keller suggested. That was the breaking point. Raymond had spent a lifetime navigating these waters, choosing his battles carefully. This would be one of those battles. No, we will not continue this in the terminal, he stated firmly, reaching for his phone. Instead, I'm going to make a call to your supervisor's supervisors, Melissa scoffed. Sir, you can call whoever you want after you leave the aircraft. Raymond ignored her, dialing a number from memory. The line connected quickly. This is Judge Raymond Chambers, Federal Appeals Court, 11th Circuit, he stated, clearly, loud enough for everyone in the first-class cabin to hear. I need to speak with Charles Montgomery immediately regarding an incident of racial profiling occurring on Highland Airlines Flight 1382. The cabin fell silent. Melissa's eyes widened as the implications of his title registered. Charles. Raymond. Chambers here, he continued after a moment. I'm currently being detained on one of your aircraft by security based on false accusations from a flight attendant who took issue with a black man sitting in first class. Yes, I'd appreciate if you could speak with the airport manager immediately. Raymond noticed Officer Rodriguez whispering urgently to Keller, who suddenly looked distinctly uncomfortable. Within minutes, the energy on the plane had transformed. Completely. A Highland Airlines supervisor rushed onto the aircraft, profusely apologetic. Judge Chambers, I can't express how deeply sorry we are for this misunderstanding. The supervisor, a woman named Barbara Wilson, stated. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. This wasn't a misunderstanding, Raymond replied calmly. Your flight attendant deliberately fabricated a threat I never made after repeatedly questioning my right to be in this seat, despite valid documentation. Barbara nodded gravely. We take this extremely seriously. Ms. Harrison will be removed from the flight immediately pending a full investigation. Melissa's face had gone from flushed to ashen. You can't do that. I've worked for Highland for 11 years. Ms. Harrison, Barbara responded firmly. Please gather your personal belongings and exit the aircraft. Your services will not be required for this flight. You're firing me, just like that? Melissa's voice rose incredulously. Your employment status will be determined after a full review, Barbara stated. But yes, you are being removed from duty effective immediately. The security officers, now excessively polite, apologized to Raymond before escorting a shell-shocked Melissa from the plane. As she walked down the aisle, the stunned silence in the cabin was broken only by the muffled sound of her indignant protests. Raymond sat back in his seat, his victory hollow. The vindication brought no joy, only a weary recognition that his position and connections had protected him this time, privileges unavailable to countless others who faced similar discrimination daily. The businessman across the aisle offered a supportive nod. Well handled, Judge. Raymond nodded back, but his mind was already racing ahead to the inevitable aftermath. The story would spread. There would be media inquiries, statements from the airline, perhaps even congressional questions given his position. What should have been a simple flight to his daughter's graduation had become yet another battlefield in America's unending racial reckoning. As the replacement flight attendant came through with excessive courtesy, Raymond closed his eyes, mentally preparing himself for the days ahead. This incident wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The remainder of the flight proceeded in awkward silence. The replacement flight attendant, a young woman named Tara, approached Raymond with almost painful deference. Judge Chambers, can I bring you anything at all? Perhaps a drink before takeoff? Or an extra pillow? Her voice carried a nervous tremor. Just water, thank you, Raymond replied, uncomfortable with the sudden overcorrection. He didn't want special treatment, just the normal courtesy afforded any passenger. Around him, the first-class cabin had divided into distinct camps. Some passengers offered supportive glances, or even quiet words of encouragement when passing his seat. Others deliberately avoided eye contact, as if his presence had become radioactive after the confrontation. A few whispered among themselves, while casting sidelong glances his way. The businessman in 3B introduced himself as Michael Donovan, a marketing executive from Chicago. "What happened to you was disgraceful," Michael said quietly. "I've flown this airline for years and never seen anything like it." Raymond nodded his appreciation, but found himself reluctant to engage. The emotional toll of such incidents always hit hardest in the aftermath, when adrenaline subsided and the familiar weight of racial fatigue settled back onto his shoulders. "I've got footage if you want it," Michael added, holding up his phone. "Started recording when she called security." This caught Raymond's attention. "You recorded it?" "Didn't seem right. What was happening?" "Thought you might need evidence." Michael's matter-of-fact tone suggested he saw this as simply the right thing to do. Raymond thanked him and accepted Michael's business card with a promise to contact him if needed. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Raymond stared out the window at the patchwork landscape below. His mind drifted back through the decades of similar barriers he'd faced as a black man in the legal profession. He remembered his first day at Harvard Law, when a professor had assumed he was a maintenance worker who had wandered into the classroom, the countless times he'd been mistaken for a paralegal or assistant, rather than an attorney during his early career. The judicial nomination process where senators had questioned his objectivity on race-related cases in ways they never did. With white nominees, each memory carried its own sting, its own lesson. Raymond had learned to navigate these waters with careful precision, always conscious that his reactions would be scrutinized through the distorting lens of racial stereotypes. Show too much anger, and confirm the angry black man caricature. Show too little response and signal that such treatment was acceptable. This exhausting tightrope walk had been his constant companion, even as he'd risen to one of the highest positions in the American judicial system. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, Clara. "How's the flight? Can't wait to see you." "Graduation rehearsal just finished." Raymond hesitated. Should he tell her what happened, or spare her the details until after her celebration? Clara was passionate about social justice. It was why she'd chosen to follow him into law. But her graduation should be a moment of unalloyed joy, not overshadowed by yet another reminder of the challenges she would face in her career. Before he could decide, another text arrived. "Dad, everything okay?" Even in his silence, she had sensed something was wrong. Their bond had always been that strong. Raymond typed carefully. "Small issue on the flight. Nothing serious. Tell you, when I see you. So proud of you." He had barely set the phone down when it rang, Clara calling. He should have known she wouldn't let it go. "Dad, what happened?" Her voice carried the familiar determination that reminded him so much of her mother. Raymond sighed and gave her the condensed version, downplaying the confrontation. Clara's response was immediate and heated. "That's outrageous. You're filing a formal complaint, right? This needs to go beyond just firing one flight attendant." "Clara, it's being handled. Let's focus on your graduation." "No, Dad. This is exactly why I wanted to become a lawyer. These incidents aren't isolated. They're symptoms of something systemic. One firing doesn't fix that." Raymond felt the familiar mixture of pride and concern that his daughter's passion always evoked. "I know, sweetheart. Trust me, I'm considering all options." "You always say that, when you're planning to let something slide for the greater good," Clara replied, knowing him too well. "Not this time, Dad. This time it needs to be addressed head-on." As they continued their discussion, Raymond noticed passengers around him beginning to use their phones as the plane offered Wi-Fi service. Several were looking in his direction, with new recognition in their eyes. Michael leaned over. "Judge, you might want to check social media. Someone posted about what happened." Raymond quickly ended his call with Clara, promising to see her soon, and opened Twitter. There it was, a post from another passenger that was already gaining traction. "Just witnessed blatant racial profiling on our Highland Air. Black federal. Judge harassed by flight attendant who didn't believe he belonged in first class. She got fired on the spot when they found out who he was. What happens to black passengers without his influence? Deers flying while black." The post already had hundreds of retweets and was growing by the minute. Raymond closed the app, a familiar knot forming in his stomach. This was exactly what he'd hoped to avoid, his personal experience becoming a public spectacle, fodder for the never-ending culture wars that seemed to consume American society. As a judge, he'd always been careful to maintain appropriate distance from political controversies. His role required impartiality, the appearance of being above the fray. Now he risked being thrust into the center of a national conversation about race that could potentially impact his judicial effectiveness. The airline's in-flight magazine in the seat pocket caught his eye, ironically featuring a cover story about Highland's commitment to diversity and inclusion, complete with carefully curated photos of smiling employees from various backgrounds. Have you ever experienced or witnessed discrimination that made you question institutional commitments to diversity? Comment number 1 if you believe Judge Chambers should file a formal complaint, or number 2 if you think he should focus on his daughter's graduation and let this incident go. Like and subscribe to see what Judge Chambers ultimately decides to do in this powerful story of confronting systemic racism. The gap between corporate messaging and on-the-ground reality was often vast, Raymond reflected. Highland Airlines might highlight diversity in their marketing materials, but what training had they provided to staff? What systems were in place to prevent and address discrimination? Had Melissa Harrison's behavior been shaped by explicit or implicit company practices? These weren't just abstract questions for Raymond. Throughout his judicial career, he had seen how individual incidents of discrimination often reflected broader institutional failings. Changing one employee's behavior, or even terminating them, rarely addressed the underlying issues. As the flight began its descent into Chicago, Raymond's phone buzzed with a notification. The airline's customer service department had sent an email. "Dear Judge Chambers, on behalf of Highland Airlines, please accept our sincere apologies for your experience today. We would like to offer you complimentary first-class upgrades for your next 3 flights with us. A member of our executive team would like to speak with you at your convenience." Raymond nearly laughed at the inadequacy of the response. 3 flight upgrades in exchange for public humiliation? It highlighted exactly how corporations often approach these issues, as customer service problems to be resolved with perks, rather than as fundamental failures requiring structural change. As the plane touched down in Chicago, Raymond made his decision. This incident, however painful, created an opportunity to push for meaningful reforms. His position gave him a platform and influence that most victims of discrimination lacked. Perhaps it was his responsibility to use that privilege, to create change that would benefit others. The question was how to proceed. A splashy lawsuit might generate headlines but not necessarily lasting impact. Working quietly with the airline might produce real changes in policy and training, but without public accountability. Clara would push for the most direct confrontation possible, while his judicial colleagues would likely counsel caution and discretion. As passengers prepared to disembark, Raymond noticed several people taking photos of him with their phones, not even attempting to be subtle. The incident was clearly spreading across social media faster than he had anticipated. He gathered his belongings and stood, nodding politely to Michael Donovan. "Thank you for your support earlier. It meant a lot." "Just did what anyone should do," Michael replied, though sadly not everyone does. That simple statement captured so much truth. Not everyone did stand up when witnessing injustice. Change required not just the courage of those directly affected, but the conscience and action of bystanders willing to get involved. As Raymond walked through the terminal, his phone began ringing constantly with calls from unknown numbers, likely journalists who had picked up the story. He declined them all, focusing instead on reaching his daughter. This was supposed to be her moment, a celebration of her achievement. Yet even now, racial reality had intruded. It was the burden they shared, the tax paid simply for existing in their skin. Raymond spotted Clara waiting by the arrivals gate, her face a mixture of joy at seeing him and anger at what had happened. As they embraced, he wondered what wisdom he could possibly share with her about navigating the world she was entering as a black attorney. What lessons from his experience would help her forge her own path with less pain? The only certainty was that their conversation would be more complicated than a simple celebration of her accomplishment. It would be yet another moment when personal, Joy had to make room for the weight of larger social realities, a familiar negotiation in their lives as Black Americans striving for excellence in spaces that still questioned their very presence. Raymond woke the next morning in his Chicago hotel room to the insistent buzzing of his phone. Squinting at the screen, he was startled to see 73 missed calls, over 100 text messages, and countless email notifications. The time showed 6:17 a.m. "What in the world?" he muttered, scrolling through the messages with increasing alarm. Most were from unknown numbers, journalists seeking comment. Several were from colleagues on the bench, ranging from expressions of support to concerned inquiries about the situation. Even his brother in Phoenix had texted, "You're trending on Twitter, Ray. Call me." Raymond quickly opened a news app to find his own face staring back at him from the top story. Federal Judge Raymond Chambers subjected to racial profiling on Highland Airlines flight. Accompanying the headline was a still image clearly taken from a passenger's video. "Good Lord," he whispered, clicking the link. The article detailed the incident with surprising accuracy, including quotes from passengers who had witnessed the confrontation. More concerning was the embedded video, a 3-minute clip shot from several rows behind that clearly captured Melissa Harrison's hostile questioning and false accusation, followed by the security officer's arrival and Raymond's revelatory phone call. The clip had apparently been posted to social media late the previous night and had exploded overnight, garnering millions of views. Multiple news organizations had picked it up, and it was now playing on morning shows across the country. A knock at his door startled him. Looking through the peephole, he saw Clara, already dressed and looking determined. "Have you seen it?" she asked the moment he opened the door. "Just now," Raymond replied, inviting her in. "It's extensive. It's everywhere, Dad," Clara said, holding up her own phone. "You're the #1 trending topic. People are calling you a hero for standing up to her." Raymond sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "I'm not a hero, Clara. I'm a federal judge who used his position and connections to avoid being thrown off a flight. That's privilege, not heroism. But you're using that privilege to highlight what happens to those who don't have it," Clara countered. "The conversations this is starting are important." Raymond nodded absently, scrolling through more notifications. Among them was an email from Charles Montgomery, the airline executive he'd called during the incident. "Judge Chambers, I cannot adequately express my personal regret over yesterday's inexcusable incident. Our CEO, Victoria Lang, would like to speak with you directly today at your earliest convenience. Please call my private line at your earliest convenience." Below that was a message from the court administrator. "Judge, the Chief Judge has called an emergency conference call with all active judges for 9 a.m. regarding the media situation. Please confirm you can join." Raymond rubbed his temples. What should have been a simple day focused on Clara's graduation had now become a complex navigational challenge through media scrutiny, professional obligations, and the opportunity for meaningful advocacy. "Dad, you need to see this," Clara said, handing him her phone. On the screen was another video, this one showing Melissa Harrison being interviewed by a local news station near the airport. Her tone was indignant as she offered a dramatically different version of events. "I was simply following security protocols," she insisted, her voice quavering slightly. "Judge Chambers became aggressive when I asked routine questions. I felt threatened, which is why I called security. Now I've been fired simply for doing my job, all because he's a federal judge who pulled rank." Raymond watched in disbelief as Melissa portrayed herself as the victim, carefully avoiding any mention of her "people like you" comment or her fabricated claim about threats. The interviewer, rather than challenging her account, nodded sympathetically. "They're already trying to spin this," Clara said, her face flushing with anger. "You have to respond, Dad." "Not yet," Raymond replied thoughtfully. "Reacting too quickly only escalates the situation. Let's see how this plays out today." His phone rang again. Jordan Williams, his former law clerk, who now worked as legal counsel for the National Coalition for Civil Rights. Raymond had mentored Jordan for years, and they had maintained a close professional relationship. "Judge, I hope I'm not calling too early," Jordan began when Raymond answered. "Apparently everyone in America is up at 6 a.m. today, Jordan. What's on your mind? I've seen the videos, sir. This incident, it's a textbook case of how discrimination operates in seemingly normal customer service interactions. The coalition would like to offer our full support if you decide to pursue action against Highland Airlines. Raymond paused. Jordan was brilliant and passionate, with a strategic mind for how individual cases could create broader change. What kind of action are you envisioning? This could set important precedent on corporate liability for discriminatory treatment by employees, Jordan explained, his voice taking on the analytical tone Raymond recognized from their court days. Most cases never get traction because the victims don't have your credibility or resources. But with your position and the clear video evidence, we could establish new standards for training, accountability, and damages. You're talking about a lawsuit, Raymond stated flatly. A carefully crafted one, yes. One that focuses on systemic issues rather than just this incident. Think about the impact, Judge. Raymond promised to consider it and ended the call, turning to find Clara watching him intently. Jordan's right, Dad. This is bigger than just what happened to you. Before Raymond could respond, his phone displayed an incoming call from Highland Airlines corporate office. After a brief exchange with an assistant, Victoria Pearson, the airline's CEO, came on the line. Judge Chambers, thank you for taking my call, she began, her voice carrying the practiced composure of a corporate executive in crisis management mode. I want to personally express our profound apologies for yesterday's inexcusable incident. I appreciate that, Ms. Pearson, Raymond replied neutrally. We've already terminated Ms. Harrison's employment and are launching a comprehensive review of our training protocols, she continued. Additionally, we'd like to offer you compensation for the distress caused. Our legal team has prepared a settlement offer that includes significant monetary damages and a first-class lifetime travel pass with Highland. The suggestion of immediate settlement was revealing. They were clearly concerned about potential litigation and public relations damage. I'm not interested in travel perks, Ms. Pearson, Raymond responded. My concern is with systemic issues that allowed this incident to occur in the first place. Of course, the CEO replied smoothly. We're committed to addressing those issues. Perhaps we could meet in person to discuss specific reforms you'd like to see implemented. We value your perspective as we work to improve. The conversation continued with Victoria outlining various diversity initiatives the airline planned to enhance. Raymond listened carefully, noting that while her proposals sounded progressive, they lacked specific accountability measures or structural changes. After ending the call, Raymond turned to Clara. They're offering money and perks to make this go away quickly. Of course they are, Clara replied with a knowing look. Standard corporate damage control. Are you considering
it?
No, Raymond said after a moment. But I need to think carefully about next steps. My position on the bench comes with certain ethical constraints about public advocacy. As they prepared to leave for Clara's graduation ceremony, Raymond's phone chimed with another notification. Melissa Harrison had appeared on a popular conservative morning show, now claiming she was the victim of cancel culture, and that the airline had thrown her under the bus to appease woke mobs. This narrative is spreading, Clara noted with disgust. They're turning her into a martyr on certain channels. Throughout the morning, the story continued to evolve with remarkable speed. As Raymond and Clara drove to the law school, news, radio reported that Highland Airlines' stock had dropped 2% in pre-market trading due to boycott threats. Simultaneously, counter hashtags supporting Melissa had begun trending among certain political groups. At the graduation venue, Raymond was immediately recognized by several faculty members and parents who approached with supportive comments. The law school dean pulled him aside before the ceremony. Judge Chambers, what an unfortunate situation you've experienced, the dean said, shaking Raymond's hand firmly. Please know the entire faculty stands with you. We're proud to have you as a parent in our community. Raymond thanked him politely but felt a familiar discomfort. While well-intentioned, these expressions of solidarity often highlighted how racial incidents became spectacles that overtook all other aspects of Black identity and achievement. Today should be about Clara's accomplishment, not his experience with discrimination. As they found their seats, Raymond noticed people taking surreptitious photos of him with their phones. What should have been a proud, private family moment had become a public performance. Clara sensed his discomfort. "Try to ignore it, Dad. Focus on the good that might come from all this attention." The graduation ceremony proceeded beautifully, with Clara receiving special recognition for her work in the law school's civil rights clinic. As she crossed the stage to receive her diploma, Raymond felt a surge of emotion. Pride in her accomplishment mingled with anxiety about the challenges she would face in the profession. When they returned to Raymond's hotel afterward, the situation had escalated further. Highland Airlines had released an official statement distancing themselves from Melissa Harrison and reaffirming their commitment to inclusivity. Meanwhile, conservative media outlets were increasingly portraying Melissa as a dedicated employee, victimized by political correctness. "They're creating two completely different realities from the same incident," Clara observed, scrolling through news articles on her laptop. Raymond's phone rang again. This time it was the chief judge of his circuit. "Raymond, I hope I'm not interrupting your daughter's celebration," Chief Judge Harrington began. "We've just returned from the ceremony," Raymond assured him. Good. Look, I'll be direct. The judicial conference is concerned about the media attention. Conservative senators are already questioning whether your involvement in this incident compromises your impartiality in discrimination cases." Raymond wasn't surprised. Throughout his career, his identity had been used to question his objectivity in ways white judges never experienced. The double standard was familiar. White judges were presumed impartial in all cases, while black judges faced scrutiny about bias whenever race was remotely relevant. "I understand the concerns, William, but I was a passenger subjected to discrimination, not an activist seeking attention." "I know that," the chief judge replied. "And personally, I think you handled it with remarkable restraint. But you know how these things work. The conference is suggesting you recuse yourself from discrimination cases for the next few months until this blows over." The recommendation stung, though Raymond had anticipated it. "I'll take that under advisement," he replied neutrally. After ending the call, he turned to find Clara watching him with concern. "They want you to step back from discrimination cases, don't they?" she asked, her legal mind immediately grasping the implications. Raymond nodded. "Temporarily. It's not unusual in high-profile situations." "It's completely unfair," Clara objected. "A white judge wouldn't face the same scrutiny." "No, they wouldn't," Raymond agreed. "But this is the reality we navigate. Now tell me more about your plans after the bar exam." Their conversation was interrupted by another call, this time from Jordan Williams again. "Judge, something significant has developed," Jordan began without preamble. "We've been contacted by 3 former Highland Airlines employees who claim Melissa Harrison has a history of similar incidents with minority passengers. Apparently, the airline received multiple complaints but took minimal action. This new information shifted the landscape considerably. If Highland had known about previous discriminatory behavior and failed to address it properly, their liability would be substantially greater, and the case for systemic reform much stronger." "Can you verify these claims?" Raymond asked. "Working on it now," Jordan replied. "But Judge, these testimonies could transform this from an isolated incident into evidence of a pattern and practice. That's exactly what we need to create meaningful change." After hanging up, Raymond shared the development with Clara, whose eyes lit up with the passion for justice that had drawn her to law school. "This is exactly why you can't just accept some settlement and move on," she insisted. "There could be dozens or hundreds of passengers who faced similar treatment without the power to fight back." Raymond nodded slowly. "You're right. But any legal action I take will come with significant professional costs. The judiciary prizes neutrality above all else." "Is it really neutrality when staying silent benefits the status quo?" Clara challenged. Before Raymond could answer, his phone lit up with a news alert. Melissa Harrison would be holding a press conference in 1 hour with her newly retained attorney, a prominent conservative legal figure known for taking on anti-woke causes. Meanwhile, social media had exploded with FARC Team Melissa and Stand With Judge Chambers hashtags dividing along predictable political lines. What had been a personal experience of discrimination was rapidly transforming into another battlefield in America's culture wars. As Raymond and Clara watched Melissa's press conference on the hotel television, the former flight attendant tearfully described herself as a scapegoat sacrificed on the altar of political correctness. Her attorney announced plans to sue Highland Airlines for wrongful termination, claiming the company had violated her rights by firing her simply for following security protocols. "The distortion is unbelievable," Clara muttered. "Did she forget there's actual video?" "For some viewers, the video won't matter," Raymond replied. "They'll see what confirms their existing beliefs." His phone rang again, this time showing Charles Montgomery's number from Highland Airlines executive offices. "Judge Chambers, I need to inform you that our legal team has revised our settlement offer in light of Ms. Harrison's press conference," the airline executive began, his voice tense. "We're prepared to offer a substantially higher figure in exchange for a confidential resolution and mutual non-disparagement agreement." The subtext was clear. The airline was feeling squeezed from both sides and wanted the story to disappear. "Mr. Montgomery, I appreciate the offer, but my concerns remain focused on systemic issues rather than personal compensation. We're prepared to implement a comprehensive anti-bias training program as part of the settlement," Montgomery countered quickly, "and we'd value your input on its development." Raymond promised to consider the updated offer and ended the call, turning to Clara with a sigh. "They're getting desperate," he observed. "Good," Clara replied firmly. "That means they'll actually consider real reforms rather than cosmetic changes." As evening fell, the story continued gaining momentum. National civil rights leaders had issued statements of support for Raymond, while conservative political figures rallied behind Melissa. The incident had become a Rorschach test for America's divided perspectives on race, privilege, and accountability. Raymond's phone buzzed with a text from Jordan. "Judge, we've confirmed 2 previous formal complaints against Harrison for discriminatory treatment. Working to get documentation. This is bigger than we thought." The following morning brought another development. Victoria Pearson, Highland's CEO, had scheduled a national television appearance to address the controversy. Meanwhile, 3 additional passengers from Raymond's flight had released their own videos of the incident, providing even clearer documentation of Melissa's behavior and contradicting her public claims. As Raymond and Clara watched Victoria's interview over breakfast, the CEO struck a careful balance, expressing support for diversity and inclusion, while avoiding direct criticism of Melissa or acknowledgement of potential systemic issues. "Highland Airlines has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination," Victoria stated smoothly. "We're conducting a thorough investigation while respecting the privacy of all involved." "Classic corporate non-answer," Clara commented. "Sounds progressive, while committing to nothing specific." Raymond nodded, considering his options with judicial deliberation. By now, he had received hundreds of messages from Black professionals sharing similar experiences of having their presence questioned in premium spaces. Their stories reinforced his growing conviction that his unique position created both opportunity and responsibility. "Clara," he said finally, "I think it's time to speak with Jordan about next steps. This isn't just about one flight attendant or even one airline. It's about establishing clear corporate responsibility for addressing discriminatory treatment." Clara smiled, recognizing her father's shift from reluctant participant to purposeful advocate. "That's the judge I know." Raymond picked up his phone to call Jordan, aware that his decision would likely have significant consequences for his judicial career. But some principles transcended professional considerations. Justice shouldn't depend on one's title or connections. And now he had the platform to potentially help ensure it didn't have to. 3 days after the incident, America witnessed the peculiar spectacle of a single event generating 2 completely divergent narratives. On conservative networks, Melissa Harrison had become a cause célèbre, a dedicated employee and victim of cancel culture, who had lost her livelihood for doing her job in an increasingly anti-white corporate environment. 11 years of service thrown away because one privileged passenger pulled rank, Melissa said tearfully during an interview on National Morning. Her attorney, James Rutledge from the Liberty Legal Foundation, sat beside her nodding sympathetically. We're seeing a disturbing pattern where accusations of racism are weaponized against hardworking Americans, Rutledge added gravely. Ms. Harrison was simply following security protocols in a post-9/11 world. The interview strategically avoided mentioning Melissa's "people like you" comment, or her fabricated claim about being threatened, both clearly documented in passenger videos. Instead, it focused on her financial hardship since being fired, and the thousands of supportive messages she had received. Meanwhile, on mainstream and progressive media, Raymond's experience was presented as a textbook example of the discrimination Black Americans faced, regardless of their professional achievements or social status. If a federal judge can be publicly humiliated and nearly removed from a flight despite having valid documentation, imagine what happens to those without his connections, noted a prominent civil rights attorney on CNN. Social media reflected this division, with the Justice for Melissa and Stand with Judge Chambers trending simultaneously. The incident had been transformed from a personal experience into symbolic ammunition in America's ongoing culture wars. Raymond observed this polarization with a mixture of concern and resignation from the private office Jordan Williams had, arranged at the National Coalition for Civil Rights headquarters in downtown Chicago. He had extended his stay in the city to work with Jordan's team on developing a legal strategy. The fundraising for Harrison is remarkable, Jordan noted, showing Raymond a conservative crowdfunding page that had already raised over $200,000 for Melissa's legal defense and living expenses. She's being financially rewarded for discrimination, Raymond observed. That's quite a message to send. It gets worse, Jordan continued, sliding a folder across the desk. We've confirmed that multiple interest groups have approached her with paid speaking opportunities, book deals, and even a potential documentary. Raymond reviewed the documents with judicial detachment, though inwardly he felt a familiar weariness. America's racial division had created an ecosystem where discrimination could be monetized, either by fighting against it or by becoming a celebrated practitioner of it. Let's focus on our objectives, Raymond said, steering the conversation back to strategy. What have you learned about Highland's history with similar complaints? Jordan's expression shifted to one of focused determination. We've identified 7 formal complaints against Melissa Harrison over her 11-year employment, all filed by passengers of color, alleging discriminatory treatment. Highland resolved each with minor disciplinary actions and confidential settlements. So they were aware of a pattern, Raymond noted. Exactly. But there's more. Our investigation indicates this goes beyond one employee. Highland's customer satisfaction scores show statistically significant disparities in how passengers of color rate their first-class experience compared to white passengers. The airline has this data, but hasn't addressed the underlying issues. Raymond nodded thoughtfully. So we're looking at potential systemic failure to identify and correct discriminatory practices. Yes, sir, Jordan agreed, which makes this a much stronger case for meaningful reform rather than just individual consequences. Their discussion was interrupted by a call from Clara, who had returned to her apartment to prepare for the bar exam. Dad, you need to see the statement Melissa just released on social media, she said urgently. She's claiming you used your connections with liberal judges to get her fired and destroy her reputation. She's calling for a Highland Airlines boycott by real Americans who believe in fair treatment. Raymond sighed. Send me the link. After reviewing Melissa's inflammatory statement, Raymond turned back to Jordan. She's escalating the rhetoric, substantially. This isn't just about defending her actions anymore. She's launching political attacks on the judiciary itself. Jordan nodded grimly. Which actually strengthens our position. Her statements contradict the video evidence and undermine her credibility. But they're effective with her audience, Raymond noted. She's raised substantial funds and gained a platform that may prove more lucrative than her airline career ever was. All the more reason to pursue systemic change, Jordan replied. Individual consequences clearly aren't sufficient deterrence. Raymond glanced at his phone as another notification appeared, a message from the chief judge of his circuit requesting an urgent call to discuss the escalating media situation and its impact on the court's public standing. The professional consequences of his involvement were mounting. While Raymond had scrupulously avoided making public statements, His very identity as both a federal judge and a black man made neutrality impossible in America's polarized landscape. Simply by existing at the intersection of these identities, he had become a symbolic figure regardless of his own choices. Later that afternoon, Raymond met with Highland Airlines General Counsel and a team from their corporate office. Victoria Pearson, the CEO, joined virtually. "Judge Chambers, we want to reiterate our deepest apologies for your experience," Victoria began with practiced sincerity. "We've prepared a comprehensive settlement offer that we believe addresses both your personal experience and broader concerns." The airline's general counsel, Thomas Bradford, slid a document across the table. "We're offering a 7-figure settlement along with committing to a third-party audit of our training practices and customer experience data." Raymond reviewed the offer without expression, noting the confidentiality clause that would prevent him from discussing the incident or settlement terms publicly. "Your offer addresses compensation but not accountability," Raymond replied evenly. "The confidentiality provision would effectively bury the systemic issues we've identified." Victoria's expression tightened slightly on the video screen. "We've terminated Ms. Harrison's employment and committed to enhanced training. What additional accountability are you seeking?" Raymond leaned forward. "Transparency, public commitment to specific reforms with measurable outcomes, and most importantly, acknowledgement that this was not simply one employee's failure, but a systemic breakdown in how your company identifies and addresses discriminatory treatment." Bradford interjected immediately. "Judge Chambers, with all due respect, characterizing this as systemic goes well beyond the evidence of this single incident." "Except it wasn't a single incident," Raymond countered. "We've identified multiple complaints against Ms. Harrison spanning years, all involving passengers of color, all resolved quietly without addressing the pattern. Your own customer satisfaction data shows disparities in experience based on race. These aren't allegations, they're documented facts." Victoria and Bradford exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the extent of Raymond's information. "We'll need time to consider your perspective," Victoria said carefully. "Perhaps we can reconvene tomorrow." After they departed, Jordan smiled. "They didn't expect us to have done that much homework. They assumed I'd be focused on personal vindication rather than institutional reform," Raymond replied. "A common miscalculation when dealing with discrimination cases." That evening, as Raymond returned to his hotel, he received a call from William Harrington, the chief judge of his circuit. "Raymond, I'll be blunt. The judicial conference is concerned about the increasing politicization of this incident. Conservative senators are suggesting this could impact your impartiality in discrimination cases. The incident occurred to me personally, William. I didn't seek it out." "I understand that," Harrington replied. "But you're now working with the National Coalition for Civil Rights, which has clear advocacy positions. There are concerns about the appearance of partiality." The message was clear. Raymond's pursuit of accountability risked his judicial standing. It was a familiar double bind for black professionals. Either accept discriminatory treatment quietly or speak out and face accusations of bias for acknowledging racism's reality. "I appreciate the concerns," Raymond said carefully. "I'll keep them in mind as I consider next steps." After ending the call, Raymond stared out his hotel window at the Chicago skyline, weighing his options. He had spent a lifetime carefully navigating the constraints placed on black excellence, the unwritten rules requiring extra diplomacy, restraint, and conciliation to maintain positions that white colleagues occupied without such burdens. His phone rang again. "Clara, this time." "Dad, remember why you became a judge in the first place," she said without preamble, somehow sensing his internal conflict. "You told me it was to ensure the law protected everyone equally, not just those with power and privilege." Raymond smiled at his daughter's perception. "I did say that, didn't I?" "This is your chance to do that outside the constraints of the bench," Clara continued, "to create precedent that will protect people who don't have your title or connections." Before Raymond could respond, Jordan texted him. "Breaking news. Whistleblower from Highland HR has contacted us. Says there's documentation that airline executives were aware of pattern of complaints against Harrison. but promoted her anyway. Wants to meet. The paths before Raymond diverged even more sharply. He could accept Hyland's settlement, maintain his judicial career without disruption, and allow the incident to fade from public memory. Or he could pursue the systemic issues at potential professional cost, using his unique position to create change that might benefit countless future passengers who lacked his advantages. By morning, Raymond had made his decision. Meeting Jordan at the coalition office, he stated simply, "We're filing the class action. Contact the whistleblower and gather the evidence. This isn't about me anymore. It's about fixing a broken system." Jordan nodded, respect evident in his expression. "The Judicial Ethics Committee won't be pleased. Then I'll recuse myself from related cases as needed," Raymond replied. "But I won't be silent about discrimination I personally experienced, simply to maintain an appearance of neutrality that's only ever demanded of judges of color." That afternoon, the National Coalition for Civil Rights, with Raymond as lead plaintiff, filed a class action lawsuit against Hyland Airlines, alleging systematic failure to address discriminatory treatment of passengers of color in premium cabins. The complaint detailed multiple incidents beyond Raymond's experience, statistical disparities in customer satisfaction, and highlighted the airline's failure to address known patterns of problematic behavior. The response was immediate and predictable. Judicial conservatives called for Raymond's recusal from all discrimination cases, claiming he had revealed his bias. Hyland Airlines stock dropped 7%. Melissa Harrison gave another tearful interview, claiming she was being sacrificed to political correctness. But there was something else too. An outpouring of support from Black professionals sharing their own experiences of having their presence questioned in premium spaces. Hundreds of similar stories emerged across social media, creating a powerful collective testimony to the pervasiveness of the problem. That evening, as Raymond watched the coverage of the lawsuit filing with Clara in his hotel room, he felt a sense of purpose that transcended the professional risks. Some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost. The law should protect everyone equally, and sometimes ensuring that required stepping outside the black robes to confront injustice directly. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Clara said simply. Raymond smiled at his daughter, recognizing in her the same determination that had guided his own career. "I just hope I'm teaching you the right lessons about this profession you're entering." "The most important one," Clara replied, "that sometimes justice requires courage more than caution." Hyland Airlines' response came swiftly and aggressively. The morning after the class action filing, their legal team issued a blistering statement calling the lawsuit an opportunistic attempt to extract financial gain from an isolated incident that the airline had already appropriately addressed. Thomas Bradford, Hyland's general counsel, appeared on multiple financial news programs to reassure investors and attack Raymond's credibility. While we respect Judge Chambers' position on the bench, his involvement with advocacy organizations raises serious questions about his objectivity, Bradford stated smoothly on Bloomberg Financial. Hyland Airlines has been an industry leader in diversity initiatives, and we're disappointed to see our reputation tarnished by these unfounded allegations. The airline's strategy quickly became clear: reframe the narrative from racial discrimination to judicial ethics, positioning Raymond as an activist judge using his position improperly. Conservative legal organizations filed formal ethics complaints with the Judicial Conference, arguing that Raymond's role as lead plaintiff in a discrimination lawsuit compromised his impartiality in similar cases. Several Republican senators issued statements calling for his recusal from all cases involving racial issues. Raymond monitored these developments from Jordan's office, his expression betraying none of the stress he felt. Decades on the bench had taught him to maintain a composed exterior regardless of internal turmoil. "They're going after your reputation rather than addressing the substance of our claims," Jordan observed, reviewing the latest media coverage. "Classic deflection strategy." Raymond nodded. "It's effective with certain audiences. They know the judicial ethics angle creates division, even among those who might otherwise support anti-discrimination efforts." His phone buzzed with a message from William Harrington, the chief judge. "Emergency meeting of the circuit's ethics committee called for tomorrow. Your presence requested. This is serious, Raymond." This development wasn't unexpected, but the speed surprised even Raymond. The pressure to maintain the judiciary's appearance of neutrality was intense, and his actions had created a flashpoint that demanded institutional response. "What's your plan for the ethics committee?" Jordan asked, noting Raymond's pensive expression. "Honesty," Raymond replied simply. "I'll explain my reasoning and accept whatever consequences follow. My judicial role is important, but so is addressing discrimination that I personally experienced." As they continued reviewing strategy, Jordan's assistant entered with breaking news. Melissa Harrison had scheduled another press conference, this time flanked by several conservative congressmen who had taken up her cause. The conference was a masterclass in grievance politics. Melissa tearfully described herself as a hard-working American destroyed by the woke mob, while the politicians nodded sympathetically. One congressman went so far as to suggest that anti-white discrimination has become the last acceptable prejudice in corporate America. What surprised Raymond, however, was the announcement that the Liberty Legal Foundation had filed a counter-lawsuit against both Highland Airlines for wrongful termination and against Raymond personally for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. "They're suing you personally?" Clara asked incredulously when Raymond called to inform her. "On what possible grounds?" "It's a tactical move," Raymond explained. "They know the case against me won't stand legal scrutiny, but it creates media equivalence. Now there are dueling lawsuits rather than a clear case of discrimination." "That's outrageous!" Clara's indignation burned through the phone line. "There's video evidence of what actually happened." "Evidence matters in court, Clara, but public opinion operates by different rules." The truth of this observation became increasingly apparent as the week progressed. Conservative media outlets presented Melissa's countersuit with the same legitimacy as the class action, creating a false equivalence that muddied the waters for casual observers. Headlines about dueling lawsuits and competing claims obscured the fundamental issues and evidence at stake. Raymond's meeting with the Judicial Ethics Committee proved as challenging as anticipated. 5 fellow judges, all with expressions of grave concern, questioned him for over 3 hours about his decision to become the public face of a discrimination lawsuit. "You must understand the appearance problem, Raymond," Judge Eliza Montgomery stated. "How can litigants in discrimination cases believe you'll judge them fairly when you're simultaneously leading a lawsuit alleging discrimination?" With respect, Raymond replied, "Would you ask the same question of a judge who had been a victim of burglary and reported it to police? Would their impartiality in criminal cases be questioned?" "That's hardly an equivalent comparison," Judge Richard Whitman countered. "This case has become a political lightning rod, and your involvement with advocacy organizations adds to that perception." The underlying message was clear, if unspoken. White judges were presumed capable of objectivity regardless of their experiences, while a black judge who acknowledged experiencing racism was assumed to be compromised by that acknowledgement. After extensive deliberation, the committee reached its decision. Raymond would be asked to take a voluntary leave of absence from the bench pending resolution of both the class action and ethics complaints. While technically presented as a choice, the implications for refusing were clear. "I'll comply with the committee's recommendation," Raymond stated formally. "But I hope this body recognizes the troubling precedent this sets for judges from marginalized groups who experience discrimination." By the time Raymond left the courthouse, news of the committee's decision had already leaked to the press. Conservative outlets trumpeted it as validation of their ethics concerns, while progressive voices condemned it as punishing the victim rather than addressing the underlying discrimination. The toll on Raymond was becoming increasingly evident. Despite his outward composure, the stress had affected his sleep and appetite. Clara noticed immediately when they met for dinner that evening. "Dad, you need to take care of yourself," she urged. "This fight matters, but your health matters too." Raymond managed a tired smile. "I'm fine, Clara. I've faced worse pressures on the bench." "Not like this," she countered. "Not when you're both the judge and the judged." Their dinner was interrupted by an urgent call from Jordan. "Judge, something significant has happened. Clara's research paid off in a major way." Clara had been using her legal training to assist the legal team by analyzing patterns in Highland's customer service data. Following a hunch, she had cross-referenced customer complaints across multiple airlines, looking for industry-wide patterns rather than issues specific to Highland. Clara discovered that first-class passenger complaints showed similar racial disparities across all major carriers. Jordan explained excitedly, "This isn't just a Highland problem, it's systematic throughout the industry." This revelation transformed the scope of the case. If these patterns existed industry-wide, the potential impact of their lawsuit expanded dramatically. It wasn't just about one airline's practices, but about establishing industry standards for addressing discriminatory treatment. Would you share your thoughts on this case? Comment number 1. If you believe Judge Chambers is doing the right thing by pursuing the lawsuit, despite professional consequences. Or number 2, if you think he should have accepted the settlement and protected his judicial career. Like and subscribe to see how the airlines respond to the revelation that these discriminatory patterns exist across the entire industry. Does this change how you view the situation? Meanwhile, Raymond's legal team had been conducting depositions of Highland employees, including members of the training department. These interviews revealed that flight attendants received minimal guidance on avoiding bias in customer interactions. More troublingly, they uncovered an internal risk assessment program that used demographic factors, including race, to flag potentially problematic passengers. They actually trained staff to apply greater scrutiny to certain passengers based partly on race, Jordan told Raymond and Clara, barely containing his outrage. They called it security profiling, but it amounts to institutionalized discrimination. Victoria Pearson, Highland's CEO, continued her media campaign portraying the airline as committed to diversity, while dismissing Raymond's lawsuit as opportunistic. However, cracks in this unified front began to appear when a Highland board member publicly questioned whether the company should consider settlement given the emerging evidence. As the case gained momentum, Melissa Harrison's media support began showing signs of strain. Several outlets that had initially championed her cause grew noticeably quieter after passenger videos contradicting her claims circulated more widely. The crowdfunding campaign for her legal defense stalled as donors questioned inconsistencies in her story. The turning point came unexpectedly. Late one evening, Jordan called Raymond with news that would dramatically alter the landscape. "Judge, we've been contacted by someone from Highland's HR department. They say they have documentation proving executives were fully aware of the discriminatory impact of their policies, but continued them anyway. They're willing to turn whistleblower." This development presented both opportunity and challenge. Such evidence could be decisive in establishing corporate liability, but whistleblower cases required careful handling to protect both the source and the integrity of the evidence. "Are they credible?" Raymond asked cautiously. "Very," Jordan confirmed. "They've provided sample documentation as proof, including internal emails discussing discrimination complaints that never appeared in public records. This is exactly what we need to prove knowledge and deliberate indifference at the executive level." As Raymond considered the implications, he received another communication, this one from the Judicial Conference Ethics Officer, formally requesting his response to the multiple complaints filed against him. The letter outlined potential sanctions ranging from public reprimand to recommendation for impeachment. The contrast was stark, as evidence mounted supporting Raymond's claims of systemic discrimination. The professional consequences of pursuing that evidence grew increasingly severe. The message was clear, if unspoken. Maintaining the judiciary's appearance of impartiality was deemed more important than addressing actual discrimination experienced by a judge. That night, Raymond faced perhaps the most difficult decision of his career. The principles that had guided his 20 years on the bench, fairness, integrity, equal justice, now seemed to be in tension with the institution itself. By pursuing justice for this specific form of discrimination, he risked his position as an administrator of justice in all other matters. Clara found him sitting alone in his hotel room, staring out at the Chicago skyline, lost in thought. "You're thinking about dropping the case," she said, her perception as sharp as ever. "I'm weighing the costs," Raymond acknowledged. "Not just to me, but to the principles I've spent my life defending." The principle that matters most is that justice shouldn't depend on power or position, Clara replied. If you step back now, because of pressure, what message does that send about who deserves protection under the law? Raymond regarded his daughter thoughtfully. Her moral clarity reminded him of his younger self, before decades of legal compromise and institutional constraints had complicated his perspective. When did you become the wise one in this relationship? He asked with a small smile. I learned from the best, Clara answered. Now the student is reminding the teacher of his own lessons. By morning, Raymond had reached his decision. The fight would continue, regardless of personal cost. If the system punished those who sought to improve, that was all the more reason for reform. As news of the whistleblower spread within Highland's executive ranks, the company's unified front began to crumble. Victoria Pearson requested an urgent, confidential meeting with Raymond and his legal team. Judge Chambers, she began, her carefully cultivated corporate composure showing cracks. We believe this matter has become unnecessarily adversarial. Highland is prepared to discuss comprehensive reforms, along with appropriate compensation. Raymond exchanged glances with Jordan. The sudden shift suggested the whistleblower's evidence had rattled the company significantly. We're open to discussion, Raymond replied evenly, provided those reforms address the systemic issues we've identified and include genuine accountability measures. Victoria nodded quickly. Of course. We're prepared to be industry leaders in this regard. As they left the meeting, Jordan whispered, They're scared. The whistleblower must have something devastating. Raymond nodded. Let's proceed carefully. This case has never been about financial settlement for me. It's about creating meaningful change. That same afternoon, Raymond received an unexpected call from Thomas Bradford, Highland's general counsel, requesting a private meeting without other attorneys present. This is highly irregular, Jordan cautioned. As your attorney, I strongly advise against it. I'll hear him out, Raymond decided. Sometimes the real story emerges only in those irregular conversations. Bradford met Raymond at a quiet coffee shop away from downtown, his usual corporate confidence replaced by visible anxiety. Judge Chambers, I'm approaching you unofficially, he began after ensuring no one was within earshot. There are things happening inside Highland that even I wasn't fully aware of until recently. I'm listening, Raymond replied neutrally. The internal investigation has uncovered patterns that are deeply troubling. Melissa Harrison's behavior wasn't an anomaly. It was partly the product of training programs and policies that I believe crossed legal and ethical lines. Raymond maintained his judicial poker face, though inwardly he was surprised by Bradford's candor. Why are you telling me this directly? He asked. Bradford hesitated. Because I believe Victoria is still hoping to minimize this situation rather than address it properly. She's authorized a larger settlement offer, but not the structural changes that are clearly needed. This insider perspective confirmed what Raymond had suspected. Corporate damage control was overriding meaningful reform. It reinforced his conviction that pursuing the case was necessary, despite the increasing personal and professional costs. As Raymond left the meeting, his phone displayed yet another call from the chief judge. Raymond, the situation has escalated. Conservative members of Congress are now calling for hearings on judicial activism, citing your case specifically. This has implications beyond just your position. The message was clear. Raymond's actions were creating ripples throughout the judiciary. The institution was closing ranks, prioritizing its appearance of neutrality over addressing discrimination within its own ranks. Later that evening, as Raymond briefed Jordan on Bradford's revelations, news broke that would again transform the landscape. A former passenger had come forward with video of a separate incident involving Melissa Harrison from 6 months earlier, showing remarkably similar discriminatory behavior toward an elderly black woman in first class. Highland's carefully constructed narrative of an isolated incident was crumbling under the weight of mounting evidence. The question now was whether that evidence would be sufficient to overcome both corporate resistance and the institutional pressure being applied to Raymond from the judiciary itself. As Raymond reviewed the new video evidence, he felt a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. The validation of his experience came at the cost of knowing others had suffered similar treatment without his resources or platform to fight back. It reinforced the necessity of his current path, despite the increasing personal cost. Jordan summarized their strengthening position. We have multiple incidents, statistical patterns, evidence of corporate knowledge, and now a whistleblower with internal documentation. This case is becoming overwhelming. Raymond nodded thoughtfully. Then perhaps it's time to meet with our whistleblower and understand exactly what they know. The whistleblower meeting was arranged with elaborate security precautions. Jordan's team had secured a private office in an unmarked building, with participants arriving at staggered times through different entrances. Such measures might have seemed excessive, but corporate whistleblowers often face severe professional and personal consequences. Raymond arrived first, accompanied by Clara, who had increasingly taken on an unofficial role with the legal team. Jordan arrived 20 minutes later with 2 trusted associates. Finally, half an hour after the scheduled time, a woman in her mid-40s with a nervous but determined expression was escorted in by Jordan's security consultant. Judge Chambers, this is Patricia Winters, Jordan introduced her. She's been with Highland's Human Resources Department for 17 years, most recently as Associate Director of Employee Relations. Patricia nodded tensely. Thank you for taking precautions. Highland has already begun internal investigations to identify potential leaks. Your identity will be protected to the fullest extent possible, Raymond assured her. We appreciate the risk you're taking. Patricia placed a flash drive on the table. This contains documentation that Highland's executives won't want made public. I've been collecting it for years, hoping someone with enough influence would eventually challenge the company. Jordan connected the drive to a secure laptop as Patricia began explaining its contents. First, you should know that Melissa Harrison had 7 formal complaints filed against her during her 11 years with Highland. All involved passengers of color in premium cabins. In each case, she claimed the passengers were disruptive or didn't follow procedures. Raymond maintained his judicial composure, though inwardly he felt a surge of vindication. How were these complaints handled? That's the critical part, Patricia continued. After the 3rd complaint, our department recommended termination based on pattern recognition. Corporate overruled us. Instead, they promoted her to international, first-class routes, which are considered prestigious assignments. Jordan looked up from the laptop where he was reviewing documents. Are you saying they rewarded her after multiple discrimination complaints? Effectively, yes. The executive who made that decision, Senior VP of Operations Robert Keller, wrote in an email, which you'll find on that drive, that Harrison was exactly the type of vigilant employee we need in premium cabins to maintain standards. The implication was clear and disturbing. What Patricia was describing wasn't merely failure to address discrimination. It was tacit endorsement of maintaining standards through discriminatory treatment. There's more, Patricia continued, her voice steadying as she shared information she'd kept private for years. Highland implemented what they called enhanced customer experience protocols for first and business class 5 years ago. The training materials explicitly instructed cabin crew to apply additional verification steps for passengers who appear inconsistent with the typical premium cabin demographic. Clara leaned forward. That's barely disguised code for racial profiling. Patricia nodded. Exactly. The training never explicitly mentioned race, but the examples and illustrations made it clear what inconsistent with typical demographic meant. When several trainers raised concerns, they were reassigned. Jordan had been examining documents on the laptop. These training materials are damning. They effectively institutionalized bias under the guise of service standards. Raymond processed this information with the methodical analysis that had served him well on the bench. So Melissa Harrison wasn't simply an individual with personal biases. She was following company protocols that encouraged discriminatory treatment. Yes, Patricia confirmed. And the airline knew these protocols resulted in discriminatory outcomes. We tracked customer satisfaction surveys, which showed significantly lower scores from passengers of color in premium cabins. When HR presented these disparities to leadership, we were told to focus on overall satisfaction metrics instead. The documentation Patricia provided transformed the legal landscape of the case. This wasn't merely about one employee's actions, or even one company's failure to discipline properly. It revealed systematic training and policies that created discriminatory outcomes by design. "Why are you coming forward now?" Raymond asked, his tone gentle but direct. Patricia's expression reflected both determination and regret. "I've documented these issues for years, hoping for internal change. When I saw how the company handled your situation, immediately firing Melissa while denying any systemic issues, I realized they were making her the scapegoat to avoid addressing the real problem. It was the final straw." As Jordan's team continued reviewing the documents, Raymond stepped aside with Clara to discuss the implications. "This completely shifts our approach," he said quietly. "Harrison was following company protocols rather than acting as a rogue employee," Clara nodded thoughtfully, "which means the company's attempt to frame this as one bad actor fails completely. The real issue is the system that trained and rewarded her behavior." Over the next several hours, Patricia walked them through additional documentation. Internal communications showing executives were aware of discrimination complaints, but categorized them as customer misunderstandings, training materials with thinly veiled demographic profiling guidance, and performance reviews praising Melissa Harrison for maintaining the exclusive atmosphere of the premium cabin experience. The evidence painted a disturbing picture of corporate culture where discriminatory treatment was not merely tolerated, but effectively encouraged through training, promotion decisions, and performance metrics. As the meeting concluded, Raymond thanked Patricia for her courage. "You've taken a significant personal risk to provide this information." "It was the right thing to do," she replied simply. "I couldn't be part of this system anymore while claiming to value diversity and inclusion." After Patricia departed, Jordan's legal team remained to discuss strategy. "This evidence transforms our case," Jordan observed. "We're no longer alleging that Highland failed to prevent discrimination. We're showing they actively fostered it through policies and training." "What about Melissa Harrison?" Clara asked. "This suggests she was essentially following what she'd been trained to do." This raised a complex ethical question that Raymond had been contemplating. While the evidence shifted primary responsibility to Highland's corporate policies, it didn't absolve Harrison of her personal actions or her subsequent media campaign of misrepresentation. The focus should remain on systemic change, Raymond decided. Harrison made her choices, including fabricating claims about threats I never made. But she was also operating within a system that encouraged and rewarded the behavior that led to this incident. That evening, news broke that shifted the dynamic once again. Melissa Harrison had unexpectedly requested a private meeting with Raymond through intermediaries, away from her legal team and media supporters. "It could be a trap," Jordan warned when Raymond informed him. "Her team could be looking for something to use against you, or she might be recognizing her role in a larger system," Raymond countered. "Either way, I think it's worth hearing what she has to say." The meeting was arranged at a neutral location, a private room in the Chicago Public Library, with Jordan present but remaining silent unless legal issues arose. When Melissa arrived, she appeared strikingly different from her polished media appearances. Without the makeup and careful styling of her television interviews, she looked tired and anxious. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Judge Chambers," she began, her voice lacking the defensive tone that had characterized her public statements. "I realize you have no reason to trust my intentions." Raymond nodded, maintaining a neutral expression. That had served him well during tense courtroom moments. "What did you want to discuss, Ms. Harrison?" Melissa seemed to struggle with where to begin. "I've been thinking about what happened on that flight, about what I said and did, about how I've been talking about it since." She paused, gathering herself. "I need to tell you something important. I was following my training." The statement hung in the air between them. Raymond remained silent, allowing her to continue. "When I approached you, I was doing exactly what we were taught in our premium cabin standards training. We were shown how to identify passengers who might not belong in first class, and how to verify their right to be there." Jordan exchanged a glance with Raymond, This aligned perfectly with Patricia's whistleblower evidence. Did you recognize that this training encouraged you to treat passengers differently based on race? Raymond asked carefully. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. It was never explicitly stated that way. They used terms like maintaining the premium experience and ensuring appropriate clientele. But the examples they showed us, yes, it became clear what they meant. Her voice faltered. I'm not saying I bear no responsibility. I chose my words badly. I made assumptions I shouldn't have. But I was also doing what I'd been trained and rewarded for doing countless times before. Raymond considered her words thoughtfully. Why are you telling me this now, Ms. Harrison? Because I'm being used, she replied, an edge of bitterness entering her voice. The airline fired me immediately, making it seem like I was a rogue employee who violated their policies, but I was following their training. Now I'm seeing internal communications showing how they plan to make me the entire story while claiming they have zero tolerance for discrimination. This revelation aligned with what Raymond had suspected, that Highland was sacrificing Harrison to protect corporate practices and policies. What about your media appearances? Raymond asked. Your claims that I threatened you? Melissa's face flushed with what appeared to be genuine shame. I was angry and scared after being fired. The Liberty Legal Foundation approached me immediately with their support, and I let myself believe a version of events that protected my self-image. I'm not proud of that. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Melissa providing specific details about Highland's training practices that corroborated Patricia's documentation. She explained how flight attendants received performance bonuses partly based on maintaining an exclusive atmosphere in premium cabins, creating financial incentives for behavior like hers. As the meeting concluded, Melissa asked the question that clearly weighed on her. Would your lawsuit be willing to include wrongful termination for me? I know I made mistakes, but the company is using me as a scapegoat for policies they created and encouraged. This put Raymond in a difficult position. While the evidence supported Melissa's claim that she was following corporate training, her subsequent false allegations against him couldn't be ignored. I'll need to discuss this with my legal team, Raymond replied diplomatically. What's most important to me is creating systemic change that prevents these incidents in the future. After Melissa departed, Jordan turned to Raymond with a raised eyebrow. That was unexpected. Not entirely, Raymond replied thoughtfully. Systems of discrimination often create complex victims and perpetrators. Harrison enacted discriminatory treatment, but was also trained and incentivized to do so by corporate policies. Do you believe her apparent change of heart? Jordan asked. Skeptically. I believe she's recognized she's being sacrificed to protect corporate interests, Raymond responded. Whether that constitutes genuine remorse or simply self-interest is less clear. The following day, Highland Airlines attorneys requested an emergency conference with the judge overseeing the class action. They filed a motion arguing that Harrison's actions constituted individual misconduct rather than corporate policy, and therefore the class action lacked merit. Jordan's team countered by submitting selected portions of Patricia's documentation, carefully chosen to protect her identity, showing the systematic nature of the discriminatory practices. They also filed notice that Harrison herself might testify regarding the training she received. The corporation's response was swift and desperate. Their legal team attempted to have the whistleblower evidence excluded, claiming it was obtained through improper means. When that failed, they launched an internal investigation to identify the source, creating a climate of fear within Highland's corporate offices. Victoria Pearson, Highland's CEO, made an emergency appearance on financial news networks to reassure investors, claiming the company was the victim of disgruntled employee allegations and opportunistic litigation. However, the carefully curated corporate message was unraveling as more evidence emerged. The judge overseeing the case, Catherine Rivera, reviewed the evidence and issued a pivotal ruling. The documentation provided suggests corporate practices and policies that potentially encourage discriminatory treatment rather than isolated employee misconduct. Therefore, the class action may proceed to discovery phase. This ruling represented a critical victory. Highland would now be required to produce internal documents related to their training programs, complaint history, and executive communications regarding discrimination issues. The corporation could no longer contain the story through strategic settlement or damage control. That evening, as Raymond briefed Clara on these developments, they watched Victoria Pearson make another media appearance, this time with a subtly shifted message. While Highland Airlines maintains that Ms. Harrison's actions do not reflect our values, we are committed to reviewing all our training programs to ensure they align with our commitment to inclusivity. The careful recalibration of corporate messaging indicated Highland was preparing for the possibility that more damaging evidence would emerge during discovery. They were laying groundwork to claim they had already initiated reforms before being forced to do so. They're starting to realize they can't contain this, Clara observed. Raymond nodded. The question is whether they'll genuinely address the underlying issues or simply create the appearance of reform while maintaining the same practices under different names. The next morning brought another significant development. James Rutledge, the attorney who had been representing Melissa Harrison in her media appearances and countersuit, announced he was withdrawing from her case due to irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy. Hours later, Highland Airlines filed an emergency motion for settlement conference, indicating for the first time a willingness to discuss not just financial compensation, but also specific policy reforms. They're panicking, Jordan noted when he called Raymond with the news. Something in the documents they know we'll discover during the class action has them terrified. The case had reached a critical inflection point. Highland clearly wanted to settle before further damaging evidence became public. The question now was whether settlement terms could create meaningful, verifiable change rather than merely cosmetic reforms designed for public relations purposes. As Raymond considered Highland's request for settlement talks, he recognized that the true test of success wouldn't be the dollar amount of any settlement, but the structural reforms implemented and the accountability measures established to ensure compliance. His goal had never been personal vindication or compensation, but systemic change that would protect future passengers from similar discrimination. The evidence Patricia had provided, combined with Melissa's potential testimony about her training, created unprecedented leverage to demand such reforms. For perhaps the first time, a major corporation faced the prospect of not merely paying for discrimination, but fundamentally changing the systems that enabled it. The courtroom fell silent as Raymond Chambers took the witness stand. After months of legal maneuvering, Highland Airlines' attempts to settle the case privately had failed when Raymond and the other plaintiffs insisted on public accountability and court-supervised implementation of reforms. Now, in a packed federal courtroom in Chicago, the landmark trial was reaching its climactic moments. Raymond had made the difficult decision to step down temporarily from the bench to pursue the case, recognizing that the Judicial Ethics Committee would likely force the issue regardless. The personal cost had been substantial. His carefully built reputation for judicial restraint was now questioned in certain circles, and conservative legal organizations continued their campaign to suggest he could never be impartial in discrimination cases again. Yet as he took the oath and looked out at the crowded courtroom, Raymond felt a sense of purpose that transcended personal considerations. This case had become about something much larger than one incident on one flight. Jordan Williams began the questioning with practiced precision. Judge Chambers, please describe for the jury what happened on Highland Airlines Flight 1382 on May 15th of last year. Raymond recounted the incident with judicial clarity. Melissa Harrison's immediate suspicion, her escalating hostility, the "people like you" comment, the fabricated claim about threats, and the security officer's arrival. Throughout his testimony, he maintained the measured tone that had served him well during 2 decades on the federal bench. "How did this incident affect you?" Jordan asked. Raymond paused, considering the question carefully. Beyond the immediate humiliation, it reinforced something I've experienced throughout my career, that my professional accomplishments and societal contributions don't shield me from assumptions based solely on my race. That regardless of the robes I wear or the position I hold, I can be instantly reduced to a stereotype in certain contexts. Highland's defense attorney, Elizabeth Carrington from a prestigious corporate law firm, approached for cross-examination with calculated deference. "Judge Chambers, you've had a distinguished career on the federal bench," she began. "During that time, you've undoubtedly faced criticism and challenges to your rulings. Why did you choose to pursue such a public case regarding this particular incident?" The question was cleverly framed to suggest Raymond had overreacted to a routine service issue, potentially out of desire for publicity or financial gain. "I pursued this case because the evidence revealed it wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a reflection of systematic practices," Raymond replied evenly. "As the evidence has shown, Highland Airlines had policies and training that effectively encouraged discriminatory treatment. My position gives me the platform and resources to challenge such systems, resources many other victims of discrimination lack." Carrington shifted tactics. "You contacted the airline's executive offices directly from the plane, using your position as a federal judge. Isn't that using your status to receive preferential treatment?" Raymond met her gaze steadily. "I used available resources to address discrimination as it was occurring. The relevant question isn't whether I used my position, but why such intervention should be necessary for any passenger to receive equal treatment." The cross-examination continued for hours, with Carrington attempting to portray Raymond as publicity-seeking and overly sensitive. He maintained judicial composure throughout, answering each question with the same measured consideration he'd apply to complex legal arguments in his courtroom. When Carrington finished, Jordan conducted a brief redirect examination. "Judge Chambers, if you weren't a federal judge with connections to airline executives, what do you believe would have happened on that flight?" "Based on the pattern we've documented with other passengers, I would likely have been removed from the flight despite having valid documentation, missed my daughter's graduation, and received a form letter apology at best." As Raymond stepped down from the witness stand, the next witness was called. Patricia Winters, the Highland HR whistleblower who had provided the crucial internal documentation. Despite significant personal risk, she had agreed to testify publicly after Highland's internal investigation had identified and terminated her employment. Patricia's testimony was devastating to Highland's defense. She methodically outlined the company's history of discriminatory practices, the training that encouraged profiling of passengers who didn't fit the typical premium cabin demographic, the promotion of employees like Melissa Harrison despite multiple discrimination complaints, and most damning, executive communications acknowledging the discriminatory impact of policies while refusing to change them for fear of alienating core premium customers. During cross-examination, Highland's attorneys attempted to portray Patricia as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. She deflected these attacks with quiet dignity. "I kept documentation for years, hoping the company would reform internally. This lawsuit became necessary only when it was clear that would never happen voluntarily." The most dramatic testimony came next day when Melissa Harrison herself took the stand. After her attorney had withdrawn, she had made the surprising decision to testify for the plaintiffs, acknowledging her role in the incident while placing it in the context of Highland's training and corporate culture. "We were trained to maintain what they called premium cabin standards," as she explained, visibly uncomfortable but determined. The examples and role-playing scenarios made it clear certain passengers should receive extra verification based on whether they looked like they belonged in first class. Highland's attorneys objected strenuously to this characterization, but Patricia's documentation had already established its accuracy. The jury appeared deeply troubled by the systematic nature of the discrimination being revealed. Melissa acknowledged her personal responsibility as well. "I made assumptions about Judge Chambers based on race. I said things I'm not proud of. I falsely claimed he threatened me, but I was also following training that Highland now denies ever existed." The trial continued with testimony from other passengers who had experienced similar discrimination, airline industry experts who contextualized Highland's practices, and corporate representatives who tried unsuccessfully to distance current leadership from the documented training materials. Victoria Pearson, Highland's CEO, appeared particularly ineffective on the stand. When confronted with emails showing she had been directly informed of discriminatory outcomes from the premium cabin standards training yet approved its continuation, she claimed not to recall those specific communications. "Ms. Pearson," Jordan asked during a particularly tense exchange, Are you asking this jury to believe that as CEO, you were unaware of training materials that explicitly instructed staff to apply different standards based on whether passengers fit the typical premium demographic? Those materials were never intended to encourage discrimination, Victoria insisted, her corporate composure finally cracking. They were about maintaining service standards. What specific service standards require questioning the legitimacy of certain passengers' presence in first class? Jordan pressed. Victoria had no effective answer, and her credibility with the jury visibly diminished. As the trial entered its final phase, Highland's general counsel Thomas Bradford made a last-ditch effort to salvage the situation, approaching Jordan with an enhanced settlement offer that included both substantial financial compensation and specific reforms. Victoria is being unreasonable, Bradford confided. Several board members and I believe settlement is clearly the right path. The evidence is simply too damaging. Jordan brought the offer to Raymond, who discussed it with the legal team and other plaintiffs. The financial terms are generous, Jordan noted, and the reforms address most of our core concerns. Raymond considered the proposal thoughtfully. What about the accountability provisions? Who ensures these reforms are actually implemented rather than existing only on paper? This was the critical question. Many corporate settlements resulted in promised reforms that were quietly abandoned once public attention shifted elsewhere. Real change required ongoing verification and consequences for non-compliance. After careful negotiation, Bradford agreed to a crucial addition: a court-appointed monitor who would oversee implementation of reforms for 5 years, with authority to access training materials, complaint data, and other relevant information to verify compliance. The settlement would also establish specific metrics for measuring improvement in equitable treatment, with financial penalties if targets weren't met. With these provisions secured, Raymond and the other plaintiffs agreed to settlement rather than pursuing the case to jury verdict. While a verdict might have resulted in larger punitive damages, the negotiated reforms with verification mechanisms offered more certainty of lasting change. The settlement, when announced, was landmark in both scope and specificity. Beyond substantial financial compensation to affected passengers, it mandated complete restructuring of all customer service training with third-party anti-bias experts, elimination of any practices that encourage different treatment based on perceived passenger demographics, transparent tracking and public reporting of discrimination complaints, diverse hiring initiatives for leadership positions, court-appointed, compliance monitoring with real enforcement authority, industry-first standards for anti-discrimination protocols. Most significantly, Highland agreed to share anonymized findings with industry groups, potentially influencing practices beyond just one airline. As Raymond had hoped, the case would establish precedent that could protect countless future passengers. The media coverage was extensive, with analysis focusing on both the groundbreaking reforms and the personal cost to Raymond. Conservative outlets continued questioning whether he could return to the bench with impartiality, while progressive voices celebrated his willingness to risk his position to create meaningful change. As Raymond left the courthouse after the settlement announcement, Clara by his side, a reporter called out, "Judge Chambers, was stepping down from the bench temporarily worth it for this outcome?" Raymond paused, considering the question seriously. "Justice isn't just rendered in courtrooms," he replied. "Sometimes creating justice requires stepping into the arena as a participant, rather than presiding from above. If this settlement prevents even one person from experiencing what I and others experienced, then yes, it was entirely worth it." Later that evening, as Raymond and Clara celebrated the outcome with Jordan's legal team, the discussion turned to Raymond's judicial future. The Ethics Committee had made clear that his return to the bench would face significant scrutiny and likely restrictions on certain case types. "Are you concerned about limitations on your judicial role if you return?" Jordan asked. Raymond smiled, slightly. "Throughout my career, I've faced limitations and extra scrutiny that my white colleagues never experienced. This will be no different. What matters is that we've created change that extends beyond any individual case I might have presided over." Clara raised her glass in a toast. "To using privilege to dismantle systems that shouldn't require privilege, to navigate in the first place." As glasses clinked around the table, Raymond reflected on the journey from that moment on the plane to this landmark settlement. The personal cost had been substantial, but so was the potential impact. Sometimes justice required more than impartial adjudication. It required direct confrontation with systems designed to perpetuate inequality, even at personal cost to those willing to challenge them. The true face of justice, Raymond had come to understand, wasn't always found behind the bench. Sometimes it emerged when those with power and platform chose to use them not for personal benefit, but to create change that would benefit those without such advantages. That was the legacy he hoped this case would establish. 2 years after the Highland Airlines settlement, Raymond Chambers stood at a podium in the corporate headquarters of Skyway Airlines, the nation's third-largest carrier. Behind him hung a banner reading, "Industry Leadership in Equitable Service, Standards." As the keynote speaker for this industry conference on diversity and inclusion practices, Raymond couldn't help but reflect on the remarkable transformation his ordeal had sparked across the aviation industry. "When I boarded that flight 2 years ago, I was simply a tired judge heading to his daughter's graduation," Raymond began, addressing the room of airline executives, trainers, and customer service directors. "I could never have anticipated that. One discriminatory interaction would ultimately transform service standards for millions of passengers." The changes had indeed been profound. Highland Airlines, under the court-appointed monitoring system, had completely restructured its training programs, eliminating the problematic premium cabin standards that had encouraged profiling. The airline had also implemented transparent tracking of discrimination complaints, with quarterly public reporting of statistics and resolution outcomes. Most significantly, Highland's settlement had created a domino effect throughout the industry. Facing similar lawsuits and public pressure, 5 other major carriers had proactively implemented comparable reforms. The industry association had established new best practices guidelines for equitable treatment, and customer satisfaction scores among passengers of color had shown measurable improvement across all participating airlines. "The most meaningful change," Raymond continued, "isn't found in corporate policies or training manuals. It's experienced by the thousands of passengers who now board flights without having their presence questioned based on how they look. It's measured in dignity preserved rather than dignity restored after harm." After his speech, Victoria Pearson, who had remained Highland's CEO despite the settlement turmoil, approached Raymond somewhat awkwardly. "Judge Chambers, your insights today were valuable," she offered with corporate politeness. "Highland has learned difficult but important lessons through this process." Raymond nodded, noting that her language still placed the discrimination in passive terms, rather than acknowledging direct corporate responsibility. True cultural change clearly remained a work in progress, even as policy reforms advanced. "The monitoring reports show promising improvements," Raymond replied diplomatically. "I hope those continue beyond the required 5-year period." Later that evening, Raymond met Clara for dinner to celebrate the 2nd anniversary of the settlement. Now a practicing civil rights attorney with a national advocacy organization, Clara had built upon her father's case to develop new legal strategies for addressing systemic discrimination in service industries. "Dad, have you made your decision yet?" Clara asked as they settled at their table. The question referred to Raymond's judicial future. After a 2-year leave from the bench, the ethics committee had cleared him to return to his position, though with the condition that he recuse himself from certain discrimination cases for 1 additional year. "I've decided to accept the conditions and return," Raymond said. "The restrictions are a small price to pay for the perspective I've gained through this journey." Clara smiled. "The judiciary needs your voice more than ever, especially now that you've experienced both sides of the system." Raymond's phone buzzed with a notification, an email from Jordan Williams with the subject line, "Melissa Harrison Update." Opening it, he found news that Melissa had completed a specialized training program in diversity and inclusion practices and had been hired by a corporate consulting firm that worked with service industry companies on anti-bias initiatives. "Melissa seems to have found an unexpected new path," Raymond observed, showing Clara the email. "Redemption comes in strange forms," Clara replied thoughtfully. "She's using her experience to prevent others from making the same mistakes. There's some justice in that." Indeed, Melissa's journey had been one of the more surprising outcomes of the case. After testifying about Highland's discriminatory training practices, she had publicly apologized for her actions and for her subsequent misrepresentations in the media. While some viewed her transformation skeptically as self-interested rehabilitation, she had consistently acknowledged her personal responsibility while also contextualizing it within Highland's corporate culture. Raymond's own Foundation for Equitable Access, established with a portion of his settlement funds, had grown into a significant resource for victims of discrimination who lacked the platform or resources to seek redress. The foundation provided both legal support and advocacy training, helping transform individual experiences of discrimination into catalysts for systemic change. As Raymond and Clara enjoyed their dinner, a young black flight attendant approached their table somewhat hesitantly. "Excuse me, Judge Chambers. I hope I'm not interrupting," she began. "I just wanted to thank you. I started working for Skyway Airlines last year, and our entire training program emphasizes equal treatment, regardless of how passengers look or dress. My trainers specifically discussed your case as a turning point for the industry." This kind of encounter had become increasingly common for Raymond. People sharing how the settlement had created tangible improvements in their professional environments or personal experiences. These moments of connection reinforced the value of having pursued systemic change, rather than merely personal compensation or vindication. The following week brought Raymond back to the federal courthouse, where he had presided for 20 years, before his leave of absence. Walking through the judge's entrance, a small but meaningful privilege he had been denied on his first day on the bench decades earlier, he felt both the weight of returning and the unique perspective his journey had provided. Chief Judge William Harrington greeted him warmly, if somewhat cautiously. The Highland Airlines case had created tensions within the judiciary, with some colleagues viewing Raymond's public advocacy as incompatible with judicial neutrality, while others privately supported his courage in confronting discrimination. "Welcome back, Raymond," Harrington said, shaking his hand. "Your chambers are ready whenever you are." "Thank you, William. It feels good to return, though with a somewhat different perspective than when I left." "I imagine so," Harrington replied, a hint of uncertainty in his tone. "The Ethics Committee's restrictions aside, how do you see your role on the bench after everything that's happened?" It was the question Raymond had contemplated most deeply during his absence. How would his experience as a discrimination plaintiff affect his judicial perspective? Would it compromise his impartiality, as critics suggested, or enhance his understanding of justice's practical application? "I believe I return with a deeper appreciation for how legal principles intersect with lived reality," Raymond answered carefully. "Nothing in my experience contradicts judicial ethics. It simply illuminates the human impact of the principles we uphold." As he settled back into chambers, Raymond found himself reviewing cases with both the legal rigor he'd always employed and a heightened awareness of how judicial decisions affected real people navigating imperfect systems. Far from compromising his impartiality, his experience had deepened his commitment to ensuring the law served its highest purpose of delivering justice equally to all who sought it. 6 months after Raymond's return to the bench, Highland Airlines experienced another significant moment of reckoning. Robert Keller, the former senior VP of operations who had promoted Melissa Harrison despite multiple discrimination complaints, published a remarkable public apology in a major newspaper. "As an executive who prioritized certain metrics over human dignity, I bear responsibility for creating a culture where discrimination was tacitly rewarded," Keller wrote. "Judge Chambers' courage in challenging our systems forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about leadership choices I'd previously justified as maintaining standards." This acknowledgement from a former executive represented something rare in corporate America: genuine accountability rather than carefully crafted PR messaging. It suggested that beyond the policy reforms, some actual cultural transformation was occurring within Highland, and perhaps the industry more broadly. 1 year after his return to the bench, Raymond found himself at Clara's apartment, celebrating her newest achievement, leading a successful class action against a hotel chain with discriminatory security protocols similar to Highland's premium cabin standards. The case had directly built upon the precedent established by Raymond's settlement. Your case created the roadmap, Clara explained excitedly. Once we established the pattern of discriminatory outcomes from supposedly neutral policies, they couldn't hide behind claims of isolated incidents. Raymond smiled with paternal pride, recognizing that Clara was extending the work in ways he couldn't have as a judge. You've taken the foundation and built something even stronger. I had a pretty good teacher, she replied. You showed me that sometimes justice requires stepping outside comfortable roles to challenge systems directly. Later that evening, as Raymond prepared to leave, Clara showed him something she'd kept from 2 years earlier, the boarding pass from his fateful Highland Airlines flight. Such a small, ordinary document that had launched such extraordinary change. I saved it because I knew even then that flight would matter beyond that day, Clara explained. Raymond held the boarding pass thoughtfully. One moment of discrimination connected to systems of discrimination. One response connected to systems of accountability and reform. As Raymond drove home that night, he reflected on the journey. From that moment of humiliation on the plane to the industry-wide reforms now in place. The personal cost had been substantial. Professional criticism, temporary removal from the bench, public scrutiny of his every word and action. Yet the outcome had created protections for countless passengers who would never know his name, but would benefit from the systems he helped change. 3 years to the day after the Highland incident, Raymond boarded another flight, this time on Highland Airlines itself. The experience could not have been more different. The diverse flight crew greeted him with the same professional courtesy extended to all passengers. His seating in first class generated no questioning looks or demands for extra verification. The captain even made a brief announcement about the airline's commitment to equitable service for all passengers. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Raymond noticed a plaque near the galley. Highland Airlines is committed to treating all passengers with equal dignity and respect, without assumptions or bias based on appearance or background. Small changes, perhaps, compared to the vast challenges of discrimination that persisted throughout society, yet meaningful progress nonetheless, evidence that systems could be reformed when confronted directly by those with the platform and perseverance to demand change. Raymond settled into his seat, opening a book as the plane accelerated down the runway. The true measure of the case's impact wasn't in plaques or policies, but in the ordinary dignity of a black man boarding a flight without having his presence questioned. A simple right that should never have required a federal judge's intervention to secure, but now stood more protected for everyone because of his willingness to fight when that dignity was denied. The Highland Airlines case would likely remain in legal textbooks for decades as a landmark in corporate accountability for discriminatory practices. But for Raymond, its most meaningful legacy was invisible: the countless incidents of discrimination that would never occur because systems had been changed. The passengers who would never know what they had been spared because one person with privilege had used it to create protection for those without it. That, Raymond reflected as the plane lifted into the clouds, was the true face of justice. Not merely punishing past wrongs, but transforming systems to prevent future ones. Not merely winning individual cases, but creating precedents that extended protection beyond those with the resources to demand it individually. Not merely occupying positions of authority, but using those positions to ensure dignity and fairness for all. What's your take on how Judge Chambers handled this situation? Was stepping down temporarily from the bench worth creating industry-wide change? Comment below with your thoughts on how one person's stand against discrimination can create ripple effects throughout an entire system. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share this story, and hit that notification bell if you want more powerful stories about justice and transformation. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember, sometimes the most important changes start with one person refusing to accept injustice. Judge Raymond Chambers' experience reveals profound truths about discrimination in modern America. Despite his prestigious position, Raymond faced the same racial profiling that countless Black Americans encounter daily. His story demonstrates that professional achievements provide no immunity from bias. A federal judge in a tailored suit was still seen as not belonging in first class. More importantly, This case illustrates how individual incidents of discrimination often reflect systemic problems. Melissa Harrison wasn't simply one bad employee, but rather someone acting within a corporate culture that tacitly encouraged discriminatory treatment through its training, policies, and incentives. The true measure of justice isn't merely punishing individual wrongdoers, but transforming the systems that enable discrimination. Raymond's decision to pursue systemic change rather than personal compensation created protections for countless future passengers who lack his platform and connections. Perhaps most powerfully, this story shows the difficult balance between individual dignity and collective progress. The daily calculations Black Americans make about when to challenge discrimination and when to preserve energy for bigger battles reflect the exhausting reality of navigating spaces still defined by racial assumptions. True justice requires not just changing laws and policies, but transforming cultures and mindsets that perpetuate discrimination in seemingly mundane interactions. What would you have done in Judge Chambers' position? Would you have accepted the airline settlement offer or fought for industry-wide change knowing it might impact your career? Comment below with your thoughts about how far we should go to challenge racism when we encounter it. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about justice and resilience. Share this with someone who needs to understand how discrimination operates in supposedly post-racial America. Remember that creating lasting change often requires sacrifice from those with the platform to make a difference. Thank you for joining me for this powerful story. May it inspire us all to recognize and challenge discrimination wherever we encounter it, whether as direct targets or as witnesses with the power to speak up.